Last week, toward the first of the week, I put a poll on Facebook to try to figure out what lessons you guys would be most interested in studying. And because of that, we're going to begin a series this morning on the life of David. And I want to point out, this is going to be a lot like the series that we did with Abraham. It wasn't, every story that you read about Abraham isn't just about him. There were a lot of other characters that were involved in it. And so when we study the life of David, it's kind of the same way. It's not just going to be a focus on David, but rather on the events and the stories of the Bible that happened to him. And, of course, what we can learn from studying those events. I ask if you have a Bible that you'll turn over with me to 1 Samuel chapter 16. That's where we're going to begin our study of the life of David. And when you think about just a few things about David himself, before we really get into the lesson, there's no better example in the Bible, that, of course, that's considering outside the example of Jesus Christ, than how to be approved in the sight of God than the life of David. David was a man, when you study the Old Testament, 50 chapters of the Old Testament, 3 Old Testament books mention his life. And then when you go over into the New Testament, there are at least 50 references to David in the New Testament also. Now, if you're wondering where that ranks in category, he's number 3. He's just below Abraham and Moses. They're mentioned a little bit more than he is in the New Testament, but it's obvious that God considered him a very important character for us to study. And when you think about David, who was David? Well, he was the son of Jesse. He was the great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz. And he was a lot of things in life. He was a shepherd. He was a musician. He was a writer. He was a soldier. And he was a king. And he probably wrote what I would consider one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent Bible passage, especially in the book of Psalms, but Psalms 23. I think almost even people outside the church are familiar with that passage itself. And there's something that's said about him that is not said about anybody else in the Bible. In 1 Samuel 13 and verse 14, remember that the kingdom was taken away from Saul, but the word came to him, "Now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart." And the idea that David was a man after God's own heart is so significant that it's actually repeated in the New Testament in Acts 13 and verse 22, where Paul is kind of giving a history of the Jews. And then in verse 22 it said, when he had removed him, talking about God removing Saul from the office of the king, when he had removed him, he raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will." It's also interesting to note in the Bible, when you're thinking about kind of the overview of David's life, it's stated, the Bible records that David did what was right in the sight of the Lord, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. In 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 5, it says, "Because David did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite." Now that verse simply states to us that David was a righteous man. We know he wasn't a perfect man, but he was a righteous man. And so when we study the life of David, there should be a lot of great lessons that we can look at in his life and say, that's something that we need to emulate. That's a righteous example that he left behind for us to follow. Now, kind of a little bit of history leading up to the life of David. We've been studying on Wednesday nights the Old Testament, well, I guess since I got here, but kind of the history of it. Remember, the book of Judges is a book about how basically Israel turns away from God. And then you get into the realm of the king. Saul is appointed as the first king, and in his appointment, there's a little bit of turning back to the Lord. I don't know that it's so much because of Saul as it is the prophet Samuel. but there is a little bit of Israel turning back to God. And so there's kind of this, what we might call a temporary revival within the spirit of men, the nation of Israel, to turn back to God. But remember that Saul eventually becomes so stubborn and hard-hearted that he refuses to listen to Samuel, God's prophet, anymore. And so it's kind of in that background in 1 Samuel chapter 16 that we meet David for the first time. And of course, David is God's choice for the new king of Israel. What we want to focus upon this morning as we study 1 Samuel 16 is three requirements, three things that we can find that will make us useful in the service of God. And again, two of these are really going to be about Samuel, but you'll see as you study the life of David, this was something that was within his character too. Let's go to verse 1 of 1 Samuel 16. And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go, I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. And Samuel said, How can I go? If Saul hear it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, Take an heifer with thee, and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. And call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do. And thou shalt anoint unto me him whom I name unto thee. And Samuel did that which the Lord spake, and came to Bethlehem. Now after God rejects Saul as king because of his failure to obey, God appears to Samuel and reveals to him that he wants him to go and to anoint another king. And so he's sending him to the city of Bethlehem. And when he gets to the city of Bethlehem, he wants him to call Jesse and his sons to come before him. And it's interesting to point out, God doesn't tell him exactly what is going to transpire and really who he's even going to anoint. So there's a lot of specifics that God leaves out of this instruction. He just tells Samuel to go to Bethlehem, and I'll tell you what you need to do there, and I'll tell you who you're going to anoint there. Well, immediately Samuel's mind turns to Saul. And he says, well, what am I going to do? Because if Saul hears, Saul, this jealous man, hears that I'm going to anoint another king of Israel, then he's going to be angry with me. And there's a possibility that he might punish me or even put me to death. And so God says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to Bethlehem, and I want you to sacrifice. Take a heifer with you, and I want you to sacrifice that heifer to me. And so when Saul asks you what you're doing, why you're going to Bethlehem, you can say to sacrifice a heifer to the Lord. Well, that's exactly what Samuel does. But can you imagine, as you set out, first of all, you don't know who you're going to anoint. You just know that it's going to be one of Jesse's sons. God says, I'll let you know when you get there. And secondly, you don't really know what's going to happen after that. I mean, is God going to immediately place him on the throne? Is Israel immediately going to rally against or around him? And suddenly there's this uprising or this revolt. And so there's a lot of uncertainty that's known to Samuel. But God says, I'll tell you what will happen whenever you get there. And notice the reaction of Samuel. What does he do in verse 4? Samuel did that which the Lord spake. When we studied the life of Abraham, you might recall that this was one of the points that we emphasized about him. He was a man who did what God said, and sometimes he didn't know why he was doing it or where he was going. God says, get up and leave, and Abraham just gets up and leaves. In fact, remember in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8, the Hebrew writer said, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. Abraham left having no idea where he was going. But he left because God said go. God said, get your stuff together and get your family packed up, and you set out, and then I'll tell you or I'll show you the place where I want to go. Now, the point that I want to draw from that is that's how a person makes themselves useful in the service of God. There are people, Samuel was a person, and David was a person, and Abraham was a person who was looking to do what God said, and not in their own time. But immediately, whenever the commandment was given, they picked their things up and they did exactly what God told them to. And the significance of that is further emphasized in the fact that many times when they did these things, they didn't know all the details of what was going to happen. All they knew is that God told them to do something. And so they immediately did whatever God asked them to do. Now that's the lesson that I want for us to get first and foremost out of how we're going to be a useful person in the service of God. Because I think as human beings, a lot of times we want to know all the details before something happens, right? And you sit down, you have this plan, and you say, well, I can see this, and I can see where the end is going to lead me, and I can see what is going to happen along the way. And I think a lot of times people put off obeying the gospel and becoming Christians and living the faithful Christian life because they just simply cannot see all the details in front of them. You know, I've talked to many people, and you probably have too, who said, well, I'll obey the gospel whenever I get this, and this in order. When all the details are sorted out and put into order and I can see the clear path for me, then I'll do what God told me to do. The problem is this: when God tells us to do something, we need to do it immediately, don't we? And it doesn't matter if we can see the end. It doesn't matter if all the details are mapped out clearly for us in our lives or not. The point is we need to do what God asked us to do. And many of these Old Testament characters were men who obeyed what God told them to do immediately, but yet they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know all the details of it. One person has said, and I don't know who made this quote, but they said, the way to see far ahead in the will of God is to go ahead as far as you can see. You ever think about traveling to a certain destination? And wouldn't it be great if you could just, you pull your car on the road and you can just see that destination at the very end? But the problem is, traveling isn't always like that. Sometimes you have to go to the top of the mountain so you can see the next mountain, right? And then after you get to the top, you can see what lies ahead. Well, that's kind of how it is with doing God's will, too. The first thing you got to do is do what God told you to do first, and then you can see what's going to lead to next. But these men were men who did these things without having all the details mapped out for them. And that's a great example for us as Christians. If we're going to be useful in the service of God, we have to be willing to do what God commands us to do and to do it immediately. Even if we can't see and we don't understand all the details that are involved in it. The second thing that I'll submit unto you, and again, this refers to Samuel, not necessarily David, but again, you can look at his life, you'll see the same example, is we need to be people who are listening for the voice of God constantly. Let's go down to the latter part of verse 4 here in 1 Samuel 16. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming, talking about Samuel, and said, Comest thou peaceably? And he said, Peaceably I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves, and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons, and called them to the sacrifice. And it came to pass, when they were come, that he looked on Eliab, and said, Surely the Lord's anointed is before me. Now again, kind of picture in your mind, God has commanded Samuel to go to Bethlehem. And here the citizens, the elders of Bethlehem, see Samuel coming and understand that Samuel was also a judge. And we kind of studied in our Wednesday night classes how it was his custom to basically make a circuit throughout Israel where he would judge people. And so when you see this guy coming, a lot of times he was coming for judgment. And so immediately in their minds, the elders, the men of Bethlehem, are asking, what we do wrong? Why is Samuel coming to pass judgment upon us? And so when they see him, they say, are you coming to us in peace? And Samuel says, yeah, you don't have to worry about that. I've come to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. And so he calls for Jesse and his sons. And when they come to the sacrifice, notice a very important statement. I want you to kind of put this in your memory bank in verse 5. He said, sanctify yourselves. Okay, we're going to talk about what that meant here in just a little while. But Jesse and his sons come to the sacrifice. And when they come to the sacrifice and Samuel sees Eliab, he sees the firstborn son of Jesse, he thinks to himself, this is the next king of Israel, right? Evidently, there was something about his appearance, there was something about the way that he portrayed himself that led Samuel to think and to believe that this was going to be the next king of Israel. But notice in verse 7, the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as a man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. Eliab was evidently an impressive man outwardly. He was probably a very handsome man like Saul was. He probably could have been a very tall man, following in the footsteps of Saul also. And so when Samuel sees him, he's ready to anoint him as the next king of Israel. But God tells Samuel, don't judge him by his outward appearance. Don't judge him by his physical looks. Don't judge him by the height of his stature, because I have rejected him, because I don't look at men like you look at men. I don't see men like you see men. See, you guys, Samuel, when you're looking for the next king of Israel, you're looking on the outward appearance. But when I'm looking for the next king of Israel, I'm looking on the inside, the heart of mankind. Now, this is important, and this is a lesson that all of us need to get. But in order to be useful in the service of God, we need to emphasize the inside. You know, the Pharisees and the scribes, they were a group of religious zealots who were famous for the emphasis on the outward, the appearance. In fact, in Matthew chapter 23 and beginning in verse 25, Jesus warned his disciples. He says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye make the outside of the cup, or ye make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and the platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Now notice verse 28. Even so ye outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. You see, this was a group, these scribes and these Pharisees were a group who emphasized outward appearance. They wanted people to look at them and think that they were very religious people. And the way that they did that was through their outward appearance. Remember, they would put the boxes on their head that had the law. They would bind it on their arm. They would make the tassels of their garments long to show that they honored and respected God's law. And so when men looked at them outwardly, they looked to be very righteous, very pious individuals. But Jesus said, you're like a dirty cup. You look at the outside and it looks clean, but if you look within, there's all kinds of unclean things on the inside. And so he says you first clean the inside, and then the outwards can be cleaned up too, and you'll be acceptable in my sight. Well, I want you to think about that principle as it relates to how Samuel was looking for the next king of Israel. He was looking on the outward appearance, wasn't he? That's what he was focused upon. That's what he was concentrated on. But God says, I don't see like you see. When I look at a man, I don't see the outward appearance, but I see the inside. I see the heart of the individual. And when you think about our culture today, would you agree that our culture is consumed with outward appearances, that they're obsessed with outward appearances? People today are more concerned with the way they appear outwardly to other people than the way that they appear to God inwardly. And so they'll do things on the outward to make them look good to all of mankind, but the problem is on the inside they're still dirty. It's more important for us to emphasize what God sees than what man sees. And that's what God is trying to teach to Samuel here. Now, think about what would have happened if Samuel had just went with what he thought and what he believed in the way that he looked. Well, he would have anointed the wrong king, wouldn't he? But when he looked on men like God looked on men, then he found the man that God had chosen. And so we need to understand, listen, I know a lot of religion today, the emphasis is given on the outward appearance. And that's not to say that there's not a lesson for us, or there's not morals that should be exhibited in outward appearance. There is. We need to live moral lives, not immoral. We need to dress morally, not immorally. All those things need to be considered or taken into consideration. But if you study what the Bible says, when God looks upon man, He doesn't look at his outward appearance and say, now that's a righteous individual. He looks on the inside. He looks on the heart of man. And so that's what God was emphasizing here to Samuel. It's good that Samuel was still listening to God's voice, because if he didn't continue to listen to what God said, he would have anointed the wrong king, or the wrong person king of Israel. And the lesson for us is the same. As we live the Christian life, we need to keep on listening to the voice of God, don't we? Our ears need to be constantly in tune to what God is telling us. That comes today to us through the written word, through the Bible. But if we don't listen to what God tells us, if we aren't continually listening to His voice and for His voice, then there's a good chance we're going to make the wrong choice in life. Just like Samuel would have made the wrong choice in anointing the person the king. The third thing that I want to emphasize, this comes from the life of David, but linger for God faithfully. Wait for God faithfully. If we want to be useful to God, and this is one of those things that's reoccurring again, saw it in the life of Abraham, but you also see it in the life of David, we have to be patient with God. Notice in verse 8, it says, Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, Neither hath the Lord chosen this. Then Jesse made Shammah to pass by, and he said, Neither hath the Lord chosen this. Again Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel, and Samuel said unto Jesse, The Lord hath not chosen these. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Are here all thy children? And he said, There remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. Well, the first person that passes before him is Eliab. He says, This must be the next king. God says, No, that's not him. 6 other sons of Jesse, one by one, pass by Samuel, and to each one, God reveals, undoubtedly to the disappointment of Samuel, that this is not going to be the next king of Israel. Well, all of Jesse's sons pass by him, and here's Samuel, and God still hasn't chosen one. And so Samuel, in his mind, must be a little bit confused here. And he says to Jesse, Are these all your sons? And Jesse said, Well, no, they're not all of them. The youngest one, David, we left him back at home to take care of the sheep. Now, what does that tell you about Jesse's estimation and his brother's estimation of David? He was not kingly material in their sight, right? He wasn't the person that they would have thought was going to be the next king of Israel, or Jesse would have brought him along. Jesse thought, it has to be one of these other sons of mine that's going to become the next king of Israel. And so he had been left at home. He was taking care of the sheep, and Samuel asked Jesse to call for him. In verse 12, it says, And he sent and brought him in, and he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Think about, I mentioned back in verse 5, how all these men got ready, sanctified themselves to sacrifice to God and to become the next king of Israel. And if you'll study that phrase, sanctify yourselves, whenever it's used in the Old Testament of people when they're getting ready to sacrifice to God, it means change your clothes, put on a good change of clothes, take a bath, refrain from physical activities if you have a wife, and then avoid touching anything dead. What do you think David looked like when he came in from the field? What do you think he smelled like when he came in from the field? He hadn't taken a bath. He hadn't changed his clothes. He hadn't done all these outward things that these other men had done. But here he comes in fresh from the field, and he comes before him, and God says, This is the one. This is the next king of Israel. The Bible says that he was ruddy in appearance, and You know, there's some debate as to what that exactly means. Some people think it means that he was just, had red hair, maybe like Esau. Others think that it might refer to his complexion that had kind of a reddish glow to it, and the significance of that would be he didn't look like everybody else in that part of the country. Middle Easterns are usually dark-skinned people. And so he was different. He was different from everybody else. He stood out in a crowd. He had a beautiful countenance. He was goodly to look at, and God tells him immediately to anoint that man. Now, what's interesting about this story, and as we study in the life of David, this is really the point that I'm getting at. David doesn't become king immediately, does he? In fact, he has to wait until the death of Saul before he's allowed to become the next king of Israel. And it's not really until the age of 30 that David finally becomes king over all Israel. There was a period of 6.5 years, about 7 years, that he reigned only in the area of Hebron. And so how old is he at this point? Most people believe that he's somewhere at the age of 16 years old. And so how would you like to know and to be anointed the next king of Israel, but you have to wait 14 years before this comes to transpire? David, I've said this in some of our Wednesday night classes where we studied, he was a very patient man, wasn't he? He was a man who wanted God to take care of things in his own timetable and by his own means. He didn't want to try to play God. He didn't want to be the one who appointed himself king, but he wanted God to be the one to appoint and to make him king over all Israel. And so he's willing to wait 14 years for that to happen. But if you think about the people who were pleasing to God, you study them in the Bible, they were people who were patient people. Noah waited 120 years for the flood to come upon mankind. You think about Moses. Moses was supposed to be the leader of the children of Israel. And in fact, in Acts chapter 7, verse 25, you remember when he killed the Egyptian that was hurting his fellow Israelite? He says he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. Moses was ready at that point in time when he killed that Egyptian to lead Israel out of Egypt, wasn't he? But you know what? God wasn't ready yet. And so Moses had to wait 40 more years in the wilderness being a shepherd before God was ready to make him the leader of the children of Israel. The Israelites had to wait 400 years before they were led out of Egyptian bondage. And all that points to the idea is, I think sometimes it's not to discourage trying to do new things for God or trying to do what God has commanded us, but sometimes we think of ourselves more highly and we're not prepared to be there yet. We need to have some more experience in life. We need to live a little bit longer before we're ready to assume this role that God has for us to fulfill. And that was David. David was a man who waited on God until God was ready, until it was his timetable and his plan for him to be made king, which was about 14 years later. You study the life of David, and he was a man who God used to accomplish many great things, not the least of which was bringing the Messiah into the world that would save all of mankind. Why is it when you study these men, like David and Samuel and Abraham, why were they so useful in the service of the Lord? First of all, because they obeyed God immediately. Sometimes God would tell them to do things, and they didn't worry about all the details of it. They just knew that God told them to do it, and when he told them to do it, they did it immediately. We can be useful to God if we have that same attitude. The second thing is, like we studied about Samuel, he was constantly listening for the voice of God. If he'd followed his own inclination, his own thinking, and his own plans, he would have anointed the wrong man as the next king of Israel. But because he listened to what God had to say, he got things right. And if we're going to make good choices in life, we're going to have to listen to what God says. We're going to have to be constantly listening to and for his will for us in this life through the written word. And then the third thing is we're going to have to be patient. We can't allow ourselves or try to jump ahead of God because we read about Abraham, who tried that in his life. We read about or talked about Moses, who tried that too, and it just got him into more trouble. David waited. He waited for God's timing. He waited for God's plan. And when everything was right, God appointed him as the next king of Israel. We have to learn to be patient on God too. And if we'll do those three things, that will help us to be useful in the service of God. Maybe there's one here this morning who is not yet a child of God. My question for you is, do you know what you need to do? Somebody might be saying in their heart, yes, I know what I need to do, then do it. Do it immediately. That's what a good servant of God does. It doesn't worry about all the details. You can worry about that after you take care of obeying the gospel. But do it right now. If you're an erring child of God who needs to respond, do it right now. If you're here, you're subject to the Lord's invitation in any way, please come forward while together we all stand and sing.